My name is Michael Dudley. I work at the University of Winnipeg Library in Treaty 1 territory. It's also the heart of the Métis Nation in Winnipeg. I'm reading from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Final Report Executive Summary, pages 101 to 103, Burial Policy. Many of the early schools were part of larger church mission centers that might include a church, a dwelling for the missionaries, a farm, a sawmill, and a cemetery. The mission cemetery might serve as a place of burial for students who had died at the school, members of the community, and the missionaries themselves. For example, the cemetery at the Roman Catholic St. Mary's Mission in Mission, British Columbia, was intended originally for the priests and nuns from the mission, as well as the students from the residential school. During the influenza pandemic of 1918-19, many of the schools and missions were overwhelmed. At the Fort St. James School and Mission in British Columbia, the dead were buried in a common grave. At the Red Deer School, 4 students who had died there were buried 2 to a grave to save costs. In some cases, students in staff graves were treated differently. At the Spanish Ontario School, the graves of the staff members were marked with headstones that, in the case of former priests and nuns, provided names and dates of birth and death. The burial spots of students were identified only by plain white crosses. The general Indian Affairs policy was to hold the schools responsible for burial expenses when a student died at the school. The school generally determined the location and the nature of that burial. Parental requests to have children's bodies returned home for burial were generally refused as being too costly. In her memoirs, Eleanor Brass recalled how the body of one boy who had hung himself at the File Hills School in the early 20th century was buried on the Pipixis Reserve, even though his parents lived on the Carlisle Reserve. As late as 1958, Indian Affairs refused to return the body of a boy who had died at a hospital in Edmonton to his northern home community in the Yukon. The reluctance to pay the cost of sending the bodies of children from residential schools home for burial ceremonies continued into the 1960s. Initially, for example, Indian Affairs was unwilling to pay to send the body of 12-year-old Charlie Wenjack back to his parents' home community in Agape, Ontario in 1966. When Charles Hunter drowned in 1974 while attending the Fort Albany School, it was decided without consultation with his parents to bury him in Moosonee rather than send him home to Peawanuck near Hudson Bay. It was not until 2011, after significant public efforts made on his behalf by his sister Joyce, who had never got to meet her older brother, that Charles Hunter's body was exhumed and returned to Peawanuck for a community burial. The costs were covered by funds that the Toronto Star raised from its readership. A school closing might mean that the cemetery was left unattended. When the Battleford School closed in 1914, Principal E. Matheson reminded Indian Affairs that there was a school cemetery that contained the bodies of 70 to 80 individuals, most of them former students. He worried that unless the government took care and steps to care for the cemetery, it would be overrun by stray cattle. In short, throughout the system's history, children who died at the school were buried in school or mission cemeteries, often in poorly marked graves. The closing of the schools has led, in many cases, to the abandonment of these cemeteries.